Welcome to the New Republic's webinar event. I don't know, I still don't know what we call these things, but we are a panel of concerned Americans who are convening tonight to discuss a topic that is admittedly named and perhaps an overly hopeful register, American politics post-Trump. We are going to exercise optimism of the will here and act as though it were so. And I just want to briefly introduce everyone on the panel. We have Melissa Gira Grant, staff writer for the New Republic, also author of Playing the Whore and distinguished reporter in areas of criminal justice and sex work. Melissa has a great feature in the most recent print issue on the QAnon phenomenon, which we'll be discussing later, I'm sure. Then we have New Republic columnist Kimberlé Crenshaw, who is a law professor at Columbia and UCLA, and also head of the African American Policy Forum. And Christopher Caldwell, who is a contributing editor at the Claremont Review of Books, who has also a piece in the March issue of the New Republic on the working class future of the Republican Party, if there is one. And finally, Michael Kazin, history professor at Georgetown University and editor emeritus now of Dissent magazine, who has written a sort of companion piece in the March issue on the future of the Democratic Party. So welcome everyone. I wanted to just kick off, in the spirit of hopeful looking forward on the American political landscape to get a sense of what we understand as the central challenges of just governing, broadly speaking, in the next 2 years. I think there's a very narrow window with very narrow margins for the Democrats in Congress, during which there's a great deal of deserved pressure on the Biden administration to get some critical work done. And as is often the case in these kind of crises, there has to be some calculation of what the most important signal achievements should be and how you go about setting priorities within your legislative agenda, what sorts of things may be more negotiable than others. And Michael, since you sort of are writing directly to this question in our March issue, I'll put the question to you first. And I'll remind you to take yourself off mute.
Well, thanks, Chris, and thanks everybody for taking part in this. We have an ideologically broad, in some ways, group of people here, and I enjoy that. Looking forward to enjoying it. Well, in some ways, I think Biden and his team of advisors have already made clear what their priorities are. Clearly, the first priority is to pass this very large COVID relief plan, which includes an economic stimulus, of course, as part of it. And after that,
even
yes,
for breaking in, but even within that agenda item, there's a great deal of controversy in that, Ossoff and Warnock in Georgia ran very explicitly on a promise of $2,000 relief checks. The Biden administration has sort of backpedaled a bit to say, well, now there'll be $1,400 checks, given that there was an earlier $600 outlay under Trump and McConnell. So just as a simple political question, what should the Democrats do with that piece of the stimulus?
Well, in general, I think they should go as big as they can get for. I mean, obviously, as we know, they have only one vote away from, only having 49 votes, which is not enough to pass anything. But, I think I talk about this in the piece. I think the strongest programs and also the strongest messaging for their programs is to go big and to go universal, to talk about, yes, $2,000 checks, yes, environmental programs, but focus on jobs in those programs. And I think that, they have to keep this coalition together. The coalition is both broad and not very deep at the same time. And there's a lot of possibility of fragmentation in that coalition. And, in order to really pass the kind of bills they want to pass, in order for them to get anywhere close to a New Deal or a new Great Society, which is the ambition, I think, of most people in the party, they're going to need to get more votes in 2022. And it's going to be tough, as you know, for all kinds of reasons I don't have to go over for folks who are watching this. You know about gerrymandering and midterm elections and everything else. But I think the only way to do it is to very quickly give people a lot of money. And also, of course, make it clear that they are going to get viruses as quickly as possible to everybody. So really it's not always true, I think, for Democrats historically, that being as aggressive as possible and universal as possible is the right strategy. But I think it is now, because otherwise they're going to get nicked to death by McConnell. Right. They have their own serious problems, as we know. I saw the former president, Trump, put out an angry letter today about how terrible McConnell is, and that's good for Democrats to see their opposition argue with each other. At the same time, there's a lot of fear, of course, of trying to do too much and losing. But I think it looks much better to the Democratic base and keeps the coalition together much more if they're able to pass as large bills as possible. So I won't get into legislative strategy. That's not something I'm skilled in. I'm just a historian. But I think, in fact, what Biden's doing right now, at least what he says he's going to try to do, is the right strategy. I'm pleased, more pleased than I thought I'd be, in at least the way he's trying to position the party right now.
Yes. And Chris Caldwell, since Michael mentioned the latest schism on the GOP side, I guess I'll throw the same basic question to you for, what are the prospects ahead, broadly speaking, for Republicans, and specifically the issue you wrote about in the March TNR about how the Republicans can and arguably need to, in order to survive, position themselves as a party of the working class. And again, I will remind you, you are on mute as well.
Of course I am. Michael just mentioned Trump's attack on McConnell as a problem for Republicans. I'm not really sure that it is. I think that there's Trump is obviously an enormous problem for Republicans. I think that, but I think that his influence on the party is bound to wane in one way. In the course of his 4 years in power, it was possible to imagine people just drifting away from Trump. If you looked at Trump's coalition in 2016, you saw that he needed every last vote that he had. And his antics were of the sort to, even in a time of relative partisan loyalty, they were of the sort to create erosion in a coalition. You cannot win with 19/20ths of the coalition that Trump had in 2016. And now, with this spectacular escapade of Trump's, in January, with the not just the attack on the Capitol, but the other things as well, the call to Georgia, I think you've lost a good part of the Republican coalition. So it looks to me just very difficult for Trump to win the presidency again. And that's actually the only thing he can do for Republicans.
Right.
So the more alienated, so it's not going to help the Republicans to have him around as a candidate. And the more alienated he is from the legislative politics, I'd say probably the closer the Republicans are to moving past him.
So,
on this question of a working class party, one thing that in that article that I wrote for you this month, which I think is very important to remember, is that yes, Republicans have become the working class party. They have become the party of the people who were forgotten by the bosses, but they didn't necessarily want to be that party, and they don't quite know what to do with it. I mean, I think Julius Krein of American Affairs magazine was the person who said that in my article. Both parties have been, money is increasingly important in politics, as Michael's article makes abundantly clear. Both parties have been courting the people with money. It's just Republicans have been jilted. And so now they're left with a constituency that they didn't really choose, and they're going to need to learn to serve it. And part of this might involve taking a different view on things like minimum wage, okay? But I think that part of their working class agenda is going to continue to bear the Republican stamp, like opposition to immigration, backing things that are not really working class issues, but they're correlated with working class identity, such as social conservative issues. And so it'll take that form.
And this is a perfect segue to you, Kim. A big part of that stable of conservative working class cultural issues has to do with race, obviously. And we are, I think, especially in the wake of the failed impeachment trial, looking at, it's obviously happened before in our history, but a national political party that is centrally organized around a white nationalist identity. And I think that creates all kinds of important consequences for organizing in resistance to that, and also for what becomes of this very, the kind of tentative and unstable coalition that Chris has outlined. How do we talk and address the very genuine threat of, an increasingly violent white nationalist movement in our politics? And you two are on mute. So.
I told myself not to forget that.
That's what I'm here.
So yeah, thank you for this. It goes to the heart of how we center and whether we center the core of Trumpism. And I think Trump, whether he's still the elephant in the room or not, is somewhat beside the point. What he's been able to mobilize and bring back to the center of American politics is the politics of white grievance. And it has done so in such a way that it has allowed us to talk about the Republican Party, not as a white party, but, as Chris just did, as a party of the working class. And I'm wanting to say, okay, let's say the white working class. There's no way that we can talk about the working class and not acknowledge the fact that the overwhelming base of the Democratic Party is African Americans, followed by Latinos, and basically the plurality of pretty much, everybody else. We've also been through a long 4 years in which the conversation about the party being the place where the working class has been forgotten, once again, raises the question of, so they have been focusing on people of color? I mean, what are we saying when we're saying that, it is having been left out by economic and other dynamics that explains President Trump's vote? I mean, I talk about this and have talked about it over the last 4 years. If being left out of the economic recovery, or if being left out of the economics of globalization explained Trump's vote, African-American women would be all up in Trump, right? And they're not. So it's obviously telling us that there's something else going on. And I think the challenge is being able to squarely call it and look at it and address it. And frankly, one of the things that I do think is a, sort of across the political spectrum disability is the ability to see how whiteness and its grievance politics has really taken the center stage. So, let's look at the aftermath of January 6th. You have Biden basically saying this is not who we are. And I want to know, what history has he been reading? This has happened before at state levels, but the idea of a massive, aggressive, anti-democratic force being fueled by the idea that something has been taken from them is as American as apple pie. It's our history since Reconstruction. So I think the real challenge is, number one, in the political discourse, moving away from our unwillingness to call out whiteness when it's playing a political role. And I think number two, the question is whether the Democrats are able to really, grow a spine at this point. They have 2 years. And in these 2 years, they've got to double down on some of the way that the Republicans have dismantled the democracy. And I don't see that, unfortunately, as the priority it needs to be. And I think it's because it's burdened with this race frame that people don't know how to or feel uncomfortable dealing with.
So yeah, and apropos of that, you've been justly, I think, critical of Biden's track record on these issues since you chaired the Judiciary Committee during the Clarence Thomas hearings, since he did the '94 crime bill, and I think there are some obvious points of intersection here between the critique you're laying out and what Michael is saying. Obviously, voting rights has to be a central priority to restore the gutted protections that the Roberts decision and Holder created. But what would you say that Biden specifically and Democratic leaders need to do to, as you say, put this discussion, in the center of our political discourse?
Yeah, well, I'd say two things. One is to take a page from the Republican handbook, which is you got to dance with the people that brung you to the party. And the base in the Democratic Party, the constituency that actually gives him the Senate is a Black/Latino constituency. It is more specifically a Black female constituency. It is more specifically Stacey Abrams and a whole range of other Black women who got out in those trenches without the full Democratic apparatus already being ramped up to deliver that. Now, one of the problems in the Democratic relationship to its base in the past is after they've been activated, they've been deactivated. We've seen that from all the way back to Kerry's unsuccessful race, all the way to Obama's successful one. And people are, I think, aware of the fact that you call on us when you need us, and then the next 3 years, we're not a factor in this equation, which is one of the reasons why midterms are always, so disastrous. So the question is, do the Democrats learn a lesson from these defeats in the past? I can't say I'm looking at the situation and seeing clearly the handwriting on the wall. Hope springs eternal. But one thing remains clear. If you can't persuade tens of thousands of Black people to do what they need to do to vote, which is what most white people don't need to do, which is stand in line for hours in the rain, have to worry about being challenged, have to worry about being re-registered, all of the barriers that have been put in place. The only thing that overcomes that is enthusiasm. And you can't get enthusiasm if you basically look at something that Black people saw with terror in their eyes, because the history tells us, we've seen this before. I mean, my God, a Confederate flag was walking through the Capitol, and say this is not who we are.
Right.
That's not gonna get it. So I'd say just addressing and giving voice to it. And for my take, the leaked audio of the conversation between President Biden and the civil rights constituencies, that doesn't bode well. I don't know who looked worse in that, but it was almost a sister soldier kind of moment. Like, I am going to tell you, what can happen and what can't. It didn't sound like a conversation of deep collaboration representing a constituency without which he would not be in the White House.
All points well taken. And I do think there is this kind of almost reflex of learned helplessness on the Democratic side. Once you saw it in small ways in the jousting on Saturday over, are we calling witnesses in Trump's impeachment? And if so, how can we immediately give back the advantage we won? There is a Democratic, I think, fear of exercising power that is frustrating, specifically at this moment for the reasons you've explained. Melissa, I wanted to bring you in on this discussion, especially because you're covering what is the, let's just say cognitively volatile side of the GOP movement, the QAnon phenomenon, which played no small role in the January 6th insurrection. And as you point out in your piece, has been incubating a very long time, not solely on the right. And I guess the question for you is, in this sort of new moment where we're trying to figure out a politics post-Trump, what is the Q movement's likely response? Will it become more emboldened and more militant or less?
I think I said this in the piece as well. And I know we had these conversations in sort of the run up to it, right? Because we started working on this before January 6th. There was a version of this piece that was just like, I think this might just sort of like taper off. Trump is sort of a central organizing principle to QAnon. So maybe they'll just fracture and move into different other kind of far right groupings and not far right groupings. There's a substantive element of QAnon that I would not describe as far right extremists at all. So there's January 6th sort of drops in the middle of that and changes the calculus, because I think they can look at that as a win. And they absolutely look at it as a win. It's very confusing. Like, I talked to Jo Ray Perkins, who is the candidate for senator in Oregon in 2020. She was running against Jeff Merkley. Everyone was shocked that she even got the nomination, or won the primary. And then she didn't do that well against Merkley. She did about as well as Trump did in Oregon. But nevertheless, she was there on January 6th on the outside. And, as much as she's convinced that, and this is what she told me, that it was a false flag, that it was Antifa, that those weren't really QAnon people, specifically the guy with the horns, the QAnon shaman, definitely not QAnon. He's a paid actor. There's questions about him. They want to create distance from themselves in it. But on the other hand, they still see it as a win because it was a flex in the name of Trump and a way to sort of claim allegiance to whatever that becomes now. There's a piece today out in the New York Times from Ested Herndon talking about Republicans in Michigan who are, basically on the chopping block because they refuse to acknowledge that, no, the election wasn't stolen. Right. That to me is sort of one of the little festering, lingering things of QAnon that we might still see, because Stop the Steal and QAnon were absolutely interlocked. It was really hard to sort of pry them apart.
We were discussing in a meeting earlier today. You've seen, Cassidy in Louisiana be censured, Sass in Nebraska, Toomey in Pennsylvania, all of these state organizations. And this, I think, goes to a dramatic difference between the conservative movement and the Democratic coalition that Michael was describing earlier. The conservative movement is deeply entrenched in the sort of existing governing structures. And so, you may have this schism between Mitch McConnell and Donald Trump, and it may blow up into something big. But Perry Bacon has a very good piece in 538 today explaining that at the state and local level, those are the most Trump, true believing segments of the Republican Party. And those are the people in Michigan and Louisiana and Pennsylvania.
And I think it's also important to say that ideology that QAnon is made of is going to remain because it came before QAnon, right? Like what motivated people to go to Washington on the 6th wasn't just Trump. It was this sense that corrupt, perhaps even evil people had taken something from them. So it's both like the politics of grievance, but also this sort of like apocalyptic theology that comes along with QAnon that, Judgment Day is always coming around the corner. We're going to get ours if we just keep fighting. They're probably some of the most dedicated who wouldn't turn back in the face of losing an election because they believe in this preordained victory for themselves, where literally their enemies will be executed. So when you see a noose arrive at the Capitol, like, how can you not see the connection between those two things? There's already sort of schisms between others on the far right, but I think they are going to hold together as a constituency in a different way because of that sort of apocalyptic certainty.
Right. And I think it bears mentioning that the noose is also a very powerful symbol of white grievance in context.
I mean, they're inseparable. I mean, the one last thing I would say about sort of the aspects of QAnon that predate Trump, Trump wasn't necessary to them, which we talked about. He was very useful to them, just as they were useful to him and useful to some others in getting elected, like Marjorie Taylor Greene. But they're not, he's not essential to them, because what truly is animating them, in addition to that sort of apocalyptic feeling of righteousness, is that comes out of believing that there is this, vast conspiracy of sex traffickers, which is a much older idea. That's not something that they came up with. That's something that we've been living with for at least 100 years. And it always comes out of a kind of racist and nativist reaction. The first white slavery panic we saw was in the wake of Reconstruction and in the rise of immigration. This creation of this thing called the white slave that had never existed before. I don't think it's an accident that comes in the 1870s. So, and likewise, the kind of extremist vigilante violence that can come with that. And then the role of new technologies, just as the Klan was, particularly talented, I guess, at using film to get their message across. Like, I don't think it's that shocking that QAnon has been able to harness the not so new, but still like kind of a new terrain in terms of figuring out how it fits into the public square, something like Facebook. So long as those are sort of live issues, I think they can live in that unresolved tension and that unwillingness to name the white grievance at the heart of it as well.
Right. And so you foresee a Republican Party with many more Marjorie Taylor Greenes and Sally Jenkins type figures?
I mean, I don't know how much they're going to be able to turn out voters without Trump on the ballot. I think that remains to be seen. But I do think that like the remnants of their conspiratorial beliefs will linger on, right? In this sort of like reluctance to say that the election wasn't stolen, for example. The obsessiveness with voter fraud and the conspiratorial beliefs around voter fraud, well, we have roots of that going back, all with voter suppression. So I think it's the ideology is just going to get baked and baked and baked further in, or maybe we'll sort of see how that ideology has been there for a really long time. So I think it would be easy to be like, well, the jester's gone. So, these people are gone too, but I don't think that that's what's going to happen.
Right. And the other thing about conspiracy theories in general, and I think this one in particular, is that they're enormously flexible. You can, and you've seen how quickly, they went to a position of demanding that Mike Pence be hung,
Yeah.
Or as you pointed out in the piece, there's that footage of Lindsey Graham at the airport during one of the brief intervals where Lindsey Graham might have been interpreted as not supine before Donald Trump. And the crowd is suddenly chanting at Graham, sex trafficker, sex trafficker. It's just a very potent, kind of extreme weaponization, as you're saying, of a very evangelically inflected vision of politics. And just,
Chris, just to build on Melissa's taking that back, we have to also just acknowledge the convergence of the sexual, defense of white innocence with the exact way that it was mobilized to overthrow Reconstruction, to basically justify the murder, of tens well, the suppression of the vote and the murder of thousands of people, throughout the South. I think, the sort of where did this come from kind of question is, again, a failure to tell a different story, a story of how anti-democratic forces overcame the experiment of biracial democracy during the Civil War amendments, during the world created by the Civil War amendments. So, there's always, I think, with a certain dedication to conspiracy, a piece that feels material, and that is a loss. So there was a loss of the, sort of the exclusive idea of the white citizen as the American citizen, the loss of dominion over Black people that fueled this idea of insecurity and the taste for a bloodthirstiness, quite frankly, for ritualistic displays, of violence. No thing could be done to a Black body that was beyond the pale. And it was all sort of wrapped around and justified by this idea of protecting white female sexuality. So I think the what we're looking at is the new generation of that. Now we're protecting children, and it's as against and triggered by some sense that things are amiss, and there has to be a big cabal behind the things being amiss. And I think we've focused a lot on the sensibility about the cabal, but not enough about the perception of things being amiss. And when people talk about things being amiss, I think it's often framed descriptively true. I think I agree with everybody that there is a perception that something is deeply wrong. We have lost something. I think where I depart from others is the normative assessment of what that feeling of something amiss is all about. And some people will frame it as there is a legitimate grievance here that white working class people are experiencing, versus this amiss, this thing is a loss of status, a loss of privilege, a loss of prioritization. And I would say it's just a recognition that actually there never has been a material cross-class race coalition. There's been a cultural one, a social one, and it's often been exploited to sustain, white ruling class dominance. But the idea that something has been lost is far more symbolic, in my humble opinion, than has played out. And it is what connects to the sense of loss that drove the response to Reconstruction.
I think the question of what to do now about that is to, look at that, white racists who feel they've lost something, also have, as you said, have material grievances at the same time. And I don't know which is, obviously those who march, who try to kill Nancy Pelosi, the material grievance is probably less important than the other ones. But I think, there are moments, as you know, historically, when in fact, there was the beginnings, at least, promising beginnings of an interracial class coalition. The CIO, for example, some elements of what was happening in the Democratic Party in the mid-60s, they're few and far between. But to me, and this is, responding some to Kim to what you were saying before, the problem is, and Stacey Abrams said this recently in a op-ed in the Times, I think, this on Sunday, that you need obviously to turn out the base of the party, which is definitely African Americans, especially African American women, and some Latinos, of course, is depending which ones you're talking about and where they live. But you need to turn out those, white people in the suburbs who turned off to Trump and to Republicans about healthcare. And you also need to build up unions, which when white people belong to unions, vote like 20% more for Democrats than white people don't belong to unions. And that's because unions are places people learn political education, and also unions are interracial institutions. Not all of them, but they're more interracial than almost any other institution in America today, I think. So to me, the problem Democrats have, and the opportunity, I think too, is that they need to keep the base of the party happy, but they also have to keep those who voted for them in 2018, voted for them in 2020, voted for Obama twice in many cases, happy enough to keep winning elections. Because if you don't win elections, you can't give people anything except history. And I agree with you on the history. The problem is, how, again, I sound like a broken record, but how we keep a coalition which is full of people who, probably wouldn't want to spend a lot of time together, but they don't need to spend a lot of time together. All you need to do is to vote together and to support and to be in some institutions together. I think like labor unions, maybe like local Democratic parties, the state Democratic parties. So, I think having the critique of the past is really crucial, but at the same time, I think it's really important to think about, bills, acts, agendas for the Democratic Party that can, keep those people together as much as possible. And voting rights is key to that. I should have mentioned that earlier.
Absolutely, because there's I don't see the but. That's exact. I think that's the problem. That's our problem. Why we think that these are mutually exclusive. Why we think that things that include and make sure that the base can exercise, political participation is somehow counter to or doesn't speak to the rest. And I think there's a there, but we have to talk about what that there is and figure out how to address it. That to me is what I think we haven't figured out.
Yeah, and what's curious to me is sort of what Chris Caldwell was saying earlier is, the Republican Party backed into this constituency that it didn't really want and didn't really know how to provide for, and did not, in fact, really provide for during Trump's tenure in office. Chris talks about how even sort of incremental measures like Marco Rubio was trying to claw back a very small piece of the tax giveaway and met fierce resistance. So this, I think, and Chris, I'd like to bring you in to discuss this further. I mean, I do think this is a further opportunity for Democrats, right? Republicans, yes, have inherited a model of a white working class that excludes all these outgroups, including immigrants and African Americans, and they're still screwing it up. So,
I don't know that it's meant to be an exclusive thing, but I think when a Republican thinks about the working class, he thinks about Joe Lunchpail from 1967. And that's actually, I'm afraid that's exactly the way Joe Biden thinks of the working class as well. When a more 21st century Democrat thinks of the working class, they think of, let's say, the Nevada Democratic primary coalition, people who like deal cards in casinos and wait on people's tables and fold shirts at the mall. That's now, I think that the Democrats' problem is that their interest in civil rights does not really mesh with the working class as much as it does what, let's say, it's not the social justice people who are, the social justice people are indeed at the heart of the Democratic Party, okay? But it's not really the working class they're sharing it with. It's more the winners of the global economy. And in cities, those two groups can come together very nicely. In the country at large, their interests tend to diverge. And so when Michael talks in his article about sort of wanting to get the Democrats' present constituency to augment it with the sort of the Hank Williams working class type constituency, I'm not sure that those people are there anymore. I don't think that they're really a Democratic constituency anymore.
I'm not really sure, though, that, we've been talking about, phantoms and things from the past that don't exist.
Yeah.
I'm not really sure that the 1924 Joe Lunchpail or whatever is even that relevant. I mean, the workers that you brought up as an example in Nevada, I don't understand how that primarily Latina union force wouldn't find civil rights to be of interest. Like Kim was saying, these aren't an either or proposition. And I think there's a fantasy that if only we could find out how to service this fantasy of the white working class, they would stick around, they could be harnessed. But the reality is, and I think QAnon is the far example of this, what they want doesn't exist. What they say the problem is doesn't exist. There wasn't like a existential threat. Well, there was an existential threat actually to white power, right? When you open up the voting rights to people who aren't white. But there isn't like an insidious cabal trying to take over the state. So I think there's you have to sort of separate it out. It's like, what is the grievance that's real and worth responding to? And what is the grievance where we have to say, that's actually not real. That's you having an emotional response to something that you think is happening. Because you can't win those people over by saying, let's figure out how to service a need that's not legitimate.
But I think it's what is I think that it looks like it doesn't exist from the middle of the Democratic constituency, in the same way that the Democratic world in which it makes sense to allow someone who was born male to use a women's bathroom, that world doesn't exist in a Republican constituency. These worlds are really, we must never underestimate the extent to which they are hermetically separated. And a lot of this has to do, I think, with residential sorting. The way our cities have changed in the last, let's say, 50 years, okay? And our cities now are the places where the global economy happens. They're the places that are where the success of the global economy happens. They are full of people who are better off than they were a few decades ago. And that's true of investment bankers. It's true of Black people. It's true of women, particularly in the corporate world. And it's true of immigrants. They're all better off, everyone, unanimously in these cities. And so that's why in a place like Washington, D.C. or Manhattan, you can ask around in really good faith, okay? Sort of like, do you like Trump? Do you like Trump? Do you like Trump? And you'll find nobody who likes Trump. You find an incredible diversity of people, men and women, rich and poor, foreign born and born in the United States. And no one likes Trump. And that's just because Trump represents, let's say, the world of the losers of the global economy. And the world looks very different. And it's not that their grievances are imaginary. It's just that they're not registered. So you have a situation like, civil rights is at the core of this. I don't think that the people in Trump land are necessarily objecting to a fair shake for Americans of different colors and sexualities. But the law as it's set up doesn't really touch them. It's really meant for the Black person who can't get a job in a historically white company, or a gay person who can't get into a university that has a long record of hating gays, or a woman who can't move her way up the corporate ladder. It doesn't really say anything to the working class white guy who's lost his job. And so there is something really going on there. These places, the factories really did move out of these towns. They're really getting poorer. It's real. It's just there's not a language because they don't belong to the dominant political culture.
But, you know,
Sorry, I just need to say when they are,
Right.
when I'm saying it's not real, I'm not saying that the material circumstances of their lives might not be harmed. I'm
Right.
saying the person they're blaming for it, that's
Right.
not real. That's
And
not
the
real.
law that they're blaming for it is not real at all. I mean, I guess one thing I want to say is we should put a moratorium on saying working class when we're not talking about the working class. We are talking about white people of the working class who have lost in ways that are quite similar, if not exactly the same as what Black and Latino and other workers in the working class have lost. Yet we don't see them storming the Capitol. We don't see them saying that their loss is because of someone else's gain. So I really have to say that the first challenge is framing it in terms of a working class that's unracialized and then taking it to a racialized analysis when the analysis, particularly of the law, is about race discrimination. Now, I completely agree that there should be and always should have been more legal protections for workers. That's across the board. But to frame the loss from globalization, from wealth concentration that workers are experiencing across race as a distinctly racial loss, that's a racial frame that I think is deeply problematic. And as Melissa says, the itch is something that economic equity policies is not going to scratch, because the complaint is not about just that. It's about this was not supposed to happen to me. That is the part that has to be
Kim, do you think though that if you had $50 minimum wage, if you had infrastructure, good wages for white guys building, you know, the Green New Deal, that, you know, people aren't going to stop, you know, having the racial antagonisms, but maybe they'll be less important to them because they won't be able to say, hey, you people are cutting in line. You know, the Democrats are only for people unlike me, because the fact they'll be getting something from the government.
So here's why I know that's I'll just be honest. I think that's wishful. If we look at racial violence over the course of history, it's not you know, triggered by, you know, Black folks getting in line in front of white folks. It's not triggered by
I'm not saying that's true. I'm saying that's the charge. I'm not saying that's true.
And and what I'm saying is that this in my mind reflects a reluctance to see that there is a distinct set of expectations about where whiteness fits in the social hierarchy that can be triggered even in circumstances where people are relatively racially, economically fine, and moments when there's economic distress. If nothing else, this whole line does require us to think about why it is the case that a larger percentage of working class people, in fact, did vote for Biden and not Trump. A larger percentage of white folks making over $50,000, $55,000, $75,000 voted for Trump. We're just not willing to deal with the fact that racial expectation can intersect with economic marginality and stress, but it doesn't require it. And our continuous thinking that all we have to do is come up with a more egalitarian economic plan and we won't have to talk about that is precisely the denial that I worry about repeating at this moment.
You see that in who turned up on January 6th also, right? The people who turned up on January 6th are the people who could afford to get there. They, you know, as we are learning about them, as these indictments drop, these are people who had businesses. We are not talking about actual even working class people, let alone this kind of fantasy of who the working class are. These are, again, we only know about the people we have indictments for.
Yeah.
But I think that it would be wrong to say that the people who are most motivated are the ones who are hurting the most economically, because that's just patently not true for what happened for one of the most, you know, mobilizing moments, I guess, for this part of the Trump constituency. The people who feel truly aggrieved, they were not people who were struggling necessarily.
I'm not arguing that. I'm arguing that
Yeah.
that it's the people we have to worry about are not people in QAnon. People we have to worry about are people who, you know, didn't like Trump that much necessarily, but just thought that the Democrats don't like them, don't want them.
And
So-
what makes them think that, Michael? That's the thing. What makes them think that?
It's
What
a
makes
complicated
them
case.
think
I mean,
that more than Black and Latinos think that. If you're gonna say it's
Part of what makes
economic
them
policy.
think that is, in fact, I mean, I agree with Chris halfway on this, Chris Caldwell, that in fact, you know, jobs did go away. That
For everyone,
I know, but they were
Okay.
look, they were used to having good jobs, but
and so were Black
yeah.
people
yeah,
used to having jobs.
yeah, but you know, again, you've got a coalition, you've got to deal with arguments that you've got to make sure that you attract people with certain policies, that you don't lie to them, but at the same time, you can't say you got to, you know, if the main strategy of the Democrats to get white people to vote for them is to say you got to deal with your whiteness, it's not going to work. They're not going to deal with their whiteness in that way. It's not.
And I think it's not going to work to think that just giving them an economic policy is going to disabuse the expectation that they're going to be front and center. So I think I might agree with you, but I don't think your strategy actually is, like I said, scratching the thing that's itching them.
We're not going to get all of them, but I hope enough of them to get the Democrats
Well, and I think we do
a lot
have
more
enough.
seats in the Senate and the House
let's
and win
remember,
re-election.
the majority of people did vote for Biden. So this hand wringing about what are we going to do about the ones that didn't, I think is actually ignoring the fact that we do have a coalition that works.
But you're saying not, you know, it was a very narrow thing, obviously. And
it's always going to be.
people hated Trump. Well, it hasn't always been.
I would just, in the spirit both of wrapping up, because not surprisingly, we've gone over, but I would like to just throw out for the floor the idea of regional inequality as a principal driver of our politics, because I think that allows us to see, you know, there are as Chris was referencing, there are kind of these inordinately advantaged centers of social capital in the country, where there is a highly educated and affluent workforce, et cetera. And then there are pockets of the country that have essentially been deindustrialized and decolonized in certain ways. And I think, you know, I've always felt, Kim, one of the reasons we've always got along is we're both from the Midwest, and we understand, you know, this is a scorned part of the country, a place where extractive industry happened, where, you know, and God knows, you know, I grew up a white guy in the heartland, and I was surrounded by people who were aggrieved, and some of them became racists. It's absolutely true. And I was puzzled by this transformation. It happened to people in my middle school, and it wasn't purely, you know, an economic grievance. It wasn't purely a cultural grievance. It wasn't them necessarily believing that, you know, I have this zero-sum commodity that got taken away from me. It is something broader having to do with how you're viewed by the rest of the country. And what Kim said earlier really resonated with me. What we're describing as the experience of this admittedly hypothesized white working class is what for generations and centuries in our past African Americans experience. And I think if we think of ourselves more as coming from a country that has these acute, I don't even know, Chris, you use the term, I think, sorted communities.
But the residential sorting that,
right,
you know.
And I, you know.
Let's just call it.
No, but that's not what I mean. I mean sorting by affinity, not by race or by class, but where
you're saying affinity sorting is more of a powerful force in American society than
I think it's a very powerful. I think it's a very powerful thing in American politics. I mean, I think that if you go to an affluent suburb of New York, where people vote 90% for the Democratic Party, in every election, you have to say, yes, it's very powerful.
The question is how that sorting comes about. All I'm saying is the most significant sorting in our history in terms of geography is racial sorting.
That's certainly true over the stretch of American history. I don't know how you would quantify it now, but right now, I think a great deal of the residential sorting has happened through the wide open economy of the last 40 years. And, you know, drawing engineers and ambitious immigrants into places like San Francisco and leaving people without degrees and maybe without ambition, or maybe without who have problems in places like the once great cities of upstate New York. Yeah.
We forget there's a lot of poor people live in big cities.
But fewer.
You know, well, you know, I mean, I'm from New York. I'm from New York City, and in New York, you know, rents have gone up a lot, but a lot of people live in Queens and the Bronx, and you know, in parts of Brooklyn too. Not so much in Manhattan anymore.
And fewer parts.
They make just minimum wage. You know, some are in unions, more in unions than they would be if they were in, you know, Baton Rouge. But you know, still, you know, one of the problems with the cities is that they're very unequal places, actually. You know.
Yeah.
And that's one of the reasons why, actually, because there's more democratic support for unions in these places, why the unions are stronger there, because people need them as much as they do anywhere else. But
yeah, and I don't mean to say that they're homogeneous. The thing that I meant to say about cities is that everyone is kind of on an upward trajectory, and so or let's say more people are on an upward trajectory. A new immigrant to New York City may be on the bottom of the income scale, but his condition is changing, which is an optimistic thing for the most part. You know, he's not mired in poverty.
He might live in 2 bedrooms with 7 other people in his family, though. So
that's right. Oh, that's right.
Trajectory.
Yeah,
he's more likely to die of the coronavirus, depending on where he lives. I mean, equal to what? Better than what?
And you know,
better than the person who occupied the same level on the socioeconomic ladder in 1980, let us say.
So I just want to go back to all of the Black women who, by this logic, you know, should share a same kind of political set of choices. If we look back at the housing crises, the economic crises, Black women lost more wealth than any other group. They have been on a downward trajectory in terms of their median net wealth, which is about $100. I can't look at cities and see where just that constituency, and I'm not saying they're the exclusive ones, I can't look at that and say they are on an upward trajectory. I cannot dismiss the consequences of both income and wealth disparity growing exponentially. And it is a reason to have a grievance. The point isn't that some have reason and some don't. The point is how it gets expressed politically.
So Kim, I think we are talking about political expression. We're talking about partisan affiliation and voting behavior. I don't think we're talking about the very specific case of the storming of the Capitol, okay? No, Black women haven't stormed the Capitol, but they have expressed their political feelings about these things in a very, very explicit way. So for instance, you talk about the loss of money during the 2008 crash, I suppose, and value. I believe that Black women in the 2012 election voted Democratic by 98-1, if I'm not mistaken.
Absolutely.
So that shows that they are being moved by these things. They do have grievances. And this is where you and I agree. The point is how they express their grievances. They're not saying these working class white men are taking all of our jobs and all of our wealth. They're not creating militias. They're not buying into conspiracy theories. They're not saying this country is being taken away from us.
So what I'm saying is the form of the grievance is a differential that has to be talked about in terms of white supremacy.
But
That's the
only
difference that makes
well,
a difference.
Okay, I really do
Yeah,
have to
okay, okay.
gavel the proceedings closed here. I really want this to continue, and I hope in post-COVID times we can all get together and
Yep.
thrash it out. But I do want to thank everyone. We do have some questions. We don't have as much time as we had planned for because we did run over, but I'm going to read a couple. This one, I think I'll put to Michael from Bob Garrett. He asks, on paper, it would seem the 2022 Senate elections would be favorable for the Democrats. However, without Trump on the ballot, do you think what can Democrats do to motivate the kind of high turnout you saw in something like the Georgia race and the other swing state races that broke for them narrowly last time out?
Well, as I said before, voting rights reform is crucial, but of course you have to worry about each state as well. And if Republicans are in charge of gerrymandering in a particular state, as they are, say, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, where there's two big Senate races, that might be difficult. Not gerrymandering, but the voting suppression. So I'm not sure how much they can do about that besides bringing court cases. I'm not a voting rights lawyer, so I can't address that. But again, I get back. I mean, there's only two. Historical parallels can only be so useful because obviously everything changes. But there's very few times when the incumbent party in its first term, president's party, has won a midterm election, and they're most recently 2002 and way back in 1934. And what was common about those two things? The president was seen as having done something really essential for a majority of people in the country, for his base, but also beyond his base. Of course, 2002, it was how Bush responded to 9/11. We don't have to argue about that one, but and 1934, it was how FDR responded to the Great Depression. It wasn't that in 34 that FDR created all these new jobs. The unemployment rate did go down some, but not that much. It's that people thought things were going in the right direction. And so to me, what's crucial there clearly is what happens with the virus. And secondly, what happens with economic relief. And I think, again, I'm repeating myself, but repetition sometimes matters in politics. How you give each important member of the coalition something they really need. And that's what we've been arguing about. Kim and I were disagreeing about that to some degree, I think. It's going to be tough in the House, because of gerrymandering and because the Republicans only have to win 7 seats away from the Democrats, which is not very much. We haven't got time to go through each of the important Senate seats, which is but the Democrats right now have a better chance to expand their majority in the Senate than they do to hold the House. A lot can change, and we started arguing about with Trump and the Republicans. To me, it matters a lot whether Republicans nominate people who are going to be more like Marjorie Taylor Greene, but without being in her very red district. And they could do that. They did that in 2010. He nominated who believed, who had to argue about whether they believe in witches or not.
And that is a segue to a question from Tom G. I think this will have to be the last one. And we'll put it to Chris and anyone else who wants to jump in. He asked, do you see much chance of an enduring Republican schism based on, what we're already seeing kind of premonitory signs of?
Yeah, I don't, it's very hard to tell with Republicans now because they're really in flux. I tend to think that the transformation that they made in 2016 and the flight of a lot of once loyal Republicans has the die is now cast and they are a populist party. Now, things could go wrong for them, but I think that's where they are. Democrats, on the other hand, I think are in much greater danger of a split, mostly because of the conditions under which Biden was elected president. I mean, having Donald Trump in the White House and having coronavirus made it possible for Democrats to elect everybody's fifth favorite Democrat as the president. And so he's going to owe, and actually in return for the support of all these divergent constituencies, he owes them a lot. And so it's not just that he has a tough coalition to hold together, it's that expectations are very high towards him. So
that is certainly true. I would gently riposte by saying, it's also a tremendous opportunity if Biden manages to deliver on these big ticket items like voting rights and the coronavirus stimulus, but that's up to Congress. And
if I could just add really quickly, I want to give, Melissa and Kim last words really, but, Democrats have to realize that most of what they want to do is actually popular.
Right.
All things I mentioned are popular. Voting rights is popular. Every poll shows that. The question is, whether you can get the party behind it and whether Joe Biden is as, good a communicator as Ronald Reagan and FDR were. And he's not, but at the same time, Democrats have to realize, they shouldn't be so damn scared of their ideas.
This is
Because
what
their
I
ideas are
was
popular.
describing earlier is the learned helplessness problem.
Mm.
Kim, you want to weigh in?
Well, yeah, I guess I want to say two things. Absolutely, the voting rights should be. It's self-preservation. It makes no sense why they are not far more aggressive around voting rights. But I would say I come away with the same question mark that I have about why they haven't been more vigilant about the courts. The courts are lost right now. And they're lost because of 2 decades of the Democrats not playing hardball on the courts. If no one leaves with that, with anything else, one has to recognize that the courts were solid enough to push back Trump because it was an outrageous set of arguments. But almost anything else, including some legislation that we might think is exactly what the coalition would want and can hold together, may have to survive a gauntlet in the federal judiciary so that even political wins will become losses. It makes no sense to me that the Democrats have made the courts so insignificant. And I think it's going to come back to haunt us. The last thing I just want to say about, what you pointed out, Michael, about the moments that presidents had been reelected because things were going in the right direction, because something they delivered. We still have to figure out, what do we make of the fact that Obama delivered healthcare? And it did not play out that way. There is a feature, a factor, an element in American politics that we keep having a hard time calling out. And until we do, we're going to have these conundrums. Why did that happen? What explains it? What are we supposed to do about it? I think white supremacy is the core of our problem. And until we come up with a way of talking about it honestly and directly with the constituencies, giving people what they actually need, not what they think the problem is. If we can't get to that, then I really don't have a sense of what the future portends for the Democrats.
I guess I have 2 things just quickly bouncing off of what everyone has said. There's some people who've been sort of coming out of QAnon saying that they would have left sooner if only Trump had said, this isn't real, this is a conspiracy theory. And I wonder what it would be actually for people who are trying to win over people in the Republican Party to say, this stuff isn't real, the election wasn't stolen. And then how sad is that is part of the constituent services that you have to do right now to say, no, these things are not real. That is where we are. Whether or not there are millions of people who believe in these things, their beliefs are baked into the mainstream of our politics. This fantasy of a threat to white innocence is all throughout our politics. It's not just isolated to a group of conspiracy theorists who are trying to rescue children from non-existent sex trafficking. There has to be a confrontation with the reality of white supremacy versus the fantasy that white people are having something that's rightly theirs stolen from them. One of those things is real, and white supremacy is the thing that's real.
All right, well, that's a grim but appropriate note, I think, on which to end. I really want to thank everyone for your contributions. It was a really lively and spirited discussion. You can see much of it reflected in the pages of the March issue of TNR, and also I just edited Kim's column for April, which touches on many of these same subjects. So thanks once again, panelists and audience, and have a great evening.